We keep it, I guess. Those were the exact words from the President of the United States this morning, December 10th, 2025. He wasn't standing in the Situation Room. He wasn't flanked by generals at the Pentagon. He was at a White House event promoting a new luxury visa program, casually announcing that the United States military had just seized the largest oil tanker in history off the coast of Venezuela. When a reporter asked what the legal plan was for the millions of barrels of crude oil on board, he didn't cite a congressional authorization. He didn't cite a UN resolution. He simply shrugged. We keep it, I guess. But behind that casual improvisation lies a constitutional earthquake. What happened this morning wasn't just a military operation. It was a fundamental shift in how American power is exercised. We are talking about the executive branch using a sealed warrant, a secret court order to commandeer a foreign vessel in international waters, effectively bypassing Congress, bypassing public scrutiny, and potentially rewriting the rules of international maritime law overnight. This isn't just about Nicolás Maduro. It isn't just about oil prices, though. We will get to that. This is about a much deeper question. Have we reached a point where the rule of law is being replaced by the rule of might makes right? And if the president can seize commercial property on the high seas with a secret note from a judge without any debate in Congress, what can't he do? In this video, we are going to tear apart the details of this seizure that the mainstream headlines are missing. We're going to look at the ghost ship history of the vessel involved the skipper, formerly the Odessa, and the legal gymnastics the Department of Justice is using to justify this. We're going to explain why constitutional scholars are sounding the alarm about the war powers implications. And most importantly, I'm going to break down exactly what this means for you for your tax dollars, for the price of gas at your local pump, and for the safety of the global supply chain that brings goods to your doorstep. I'm Daniel Kershaw, an independent legal and political journalist. I don't work for any political party. I don't shill for any campaign. My job is simple. I follow the facts, I read the fine print of the law, and I tell you what the government, red or blue, doesn't want to say out loud. So, here's the question you need to keep in mind as we dive into this. If we allow our government to operate on sealed warrants and I guess strategies abroad, how long before those same shortcuts start being applied to rights and property closer to home? To understand why legal experts are calling this morning's events unprecedented, we have to back up. You cannot look at the seizure of the skipper in isolation. This is the climax of a strategy that has been building for months, largely in the shadows. Let's look at the timeline because the facts here paint a very specific picture. Since September of this year, just 3 months ago, the administration has quietly launched what military analysts are calling a maximum pressure campaign in the Caribbean. This hasn't been a subject of major congressional debate, but the numbers are staggering. We are talking about the deployment of over 15,000 American troops to the region. The USS Gerald R. Ford, the most advanced aircraft carrier in our fleet, has been positioned within striking distance of the Venezuelan coast. And this isn't just posturing, it's kinetic. Over the last 90 days, there have been more than 20 military strikes against vessels suspected of carrying drugs. These operations have resulted in over 80 deaths. Now, the official line is that these are counter-narcotics operations, and look, drug trafficking is a serious issue, but usually drug interdiction involves the Coast Guard boarding ships, arresting crews, and gathering evidence for trial. It rarely involves blowing vessels out of the water with airstrikes. Here is where the legal alarm bells start ringing. Under the Constitution, who has the power to declare war? Congress. Article 1, Section 8. Yet we have 15,000 troops, carrier strike groups, and lethal operations resulting in dozens of casualties, all proceeding without a formal declaration of war or a specific authorization for use of military force, AUMF, regarding Venezuela. We are seeing the normalization of shadow warfare. The administration is using the umbrella of law enforcement, fighting drugs, to conduct what looks, acts, and sounds exactly like a military blockade of a sovereign nation. And that brings us to this morning, December 10th. The administration decided to escalate from drug interdiction to something much bigger. They went after the economic lifeline of the regime, oil. But the way they did it using a legal trick involving a ship's past name is the detail that changes everything. Let's walk through the specifics of the seizure itself, because the devil is absolutely in the details. Early this morning in international waters, U.S. forces seized a supertanker currently named the Skipper. This ship was loaded to the brim with Venezuelan heavy crude from PDVSA, the state-owned oil giant. Shipping data confirms it left Venezuela's main terminal between December 4th and 5th. It wasn't heading to Cuba. It wasn't heading to some rogue state. It was heading to Asia, likely China, which currently purchases about 80% of Venezuela's oil exports. Now, here is the legal twist that you need to understand. When the president announced this at that visa event, he framed it as a blow against the Maduro regime. But legally, the Department of Justice couldn't just seize a Venezuelan ship because we don't like Maduro. That's not how international law works. You can't just take a commercial ship because you dislike the government of the country it came from. So they used a back door. According to U.S. officials speaking on background, the seizure was authorized by a sealed warrant issued by a federal judge about 2 weeks ago. But the warrant wasn't about Venezuela. It was about the ship's history. Before it was the Skipper, this ship was named the Odessa, and under that previous name, it was allegedly involved in smuggling Iranian oil to fund the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. Do you see the legal maneuver here? The administration is using a past crime involving Iran, which allows for civil forfeiture under anti-terrorism laws, to execute a current political objective against Venezuela. It's a zombie warrant. They revived a legal claim against the hull of the ship itself based on its old actions to justify seizing the cargo effectively belonging to Venezuela today. Why is the warrant sealed? Why can't the public see it? Transparency is the bedrock of the American judicial system. Sealed warrants are usually reserved for ongoing investigations where lives are at risk. Using them to conduct foreign policy actions involving major military assets is, to put it mildly, highly irregular. And when the White House press corps asked the simple question, what is the legal authority to keep the oil? Silence. They wouldn't answer. They couldn't answer. Instead, we keep it, I guess. This improvisation is dangerous, but what's even more concerning is what sources are saying is coming next. This wasn't a one-off. Officials are hinting that this is just the first domino, and they expect additional seizures in the coming weeks. If you think gas prices are volatile now, just wait until you see what this kind of maritime uncertainty does to the global market. Now, I know what some of you might be thinking. Daniel, Maduro is a dictator. He's destroyed his country. Why should I care if we take his oil? That is a fair question, and let me be clear. Nicolás Maduro has indeed rigged elections, imprisoned opponents, and driven a wealthy nation into poverty. No one is defending his record. But as a rigorous analyst, I have to look at the cost, not just to Venezuela, but to us, the American people, and to the system of law that protects us. Let's talk about money. Your money. Venezuela is an oil giant. Even in its diminished state, it exports nearly 1 million barrels a day. The moment the U.S. military starts seizing commercial tankers in international waters, the global shipping industry panics. Maritime insurance premiums skyrocket, freight costs surge, and the global oil market prices in a war risk premium. You might see this on the news as a geopolitical win, but you will feel it at the gas pump. When oil prices spike because supply lines are threatened, everything you buy gets more expensive. Food relies on trucking. Amazon deliveries rely on fuel. If the administration kicks off a cycle of seizures and retaliation, that instability tax is paid by you, the American consumer, right when many families are already struggling with the cost of living. This is the part that keeps constitutional lawyers up at night. We have a system of checks and balances. It's what separates a republic from a monarchy. When a president can use the military to seize assets and engage in combat, those 80 deaths, without congressional authorization, that system is broken. If the executive branch can use sealed warrants to hide its legal reasoning from the public, where does it stop? Today it's a ship owned by a foreign adversary. Tomorrow, could it be a bank account of a domestic political opponent? Could it be the assets of a company that disagrees with the administration? The precedent we set out there eventually comes home. If we accept that the president can act as judge, jury, and executioner regarding property rights, we are eroding the very legal protections that define America. We used to build coalitions. When we dealt with threats, we worked with the Organization of American States, OAS. We worked with Europe. We shared the burden. This operation, it's completely unilateral. It's America acting alone. That means if things go wrong, if there is a massive oil spill during a seizure, if American sailors are killed in a firefight, if this triggers a wider war, America bears the cost alone. You bear the cost alone. And speaking of costs, we need to look at the effectiveness of this strategy, because despite the troops, the carrier, and the tough talk, the data shows that this plan might actually be failing, and the consequences of that failure could land right on the U.S. border. Let's look at the scoreboard. What is the actual goal here? Clearly, it's regime change. The timing of this seizure coinciding with the Nobel Peace Prize being awarded to Venezuelan opposition leader Maria Corina Machado is not a coincidence. The administration wants to look like the good guy supporting democracy. But is the strategy working? Here are the hard numbers. In November, despite the blockade, despite the threats, Venezuela's oil exports actually increased by 3%, hitting 920,000 barrels per day. Maduro is still in power. The economic pressure hasn't toppled him. It has only made the Venezuelan people more desperate. Real strategy requires an endgame. If you topple Maduro tomorrow, what happens the day after? Who runs the security forces? Who manages the oil fields? Reports indicate that the president himself has cold feet about a direct invasion because he fears failure. So instead, we get this half measures, sealed warrants, seizing one ship and saying, "I guess we keep it." This is improvisation, not strategy, and improvisation in geopolitics is a recipe for disaster. If this economic strangulation works and Venezuela's economy collapses completely, what happens to the people? They don't just disappear, they flee. We are already seeing millions of Venezuelan refugees destabilizing Colombia, Brazil, and Panama. A total collapse would trigger a wave of migration that makes the current numbers look small. And where will those refugees head? North, toward the U.S. border. By trying to solve the Venezuela problem with blunt force, we may be creating a massive humanitarian and border security crisis for ourselves. And finally, look at the other players on the board. China buys 80% of that oil. Russia is heavily invested in Caracas. When America acts as a rogue operator, seizing ships without clear international legality, we hand a propaganda victory to our rivals. Think about the precedent. If the U.S. says we can seize ships based on secret warrants, what stops China from seizing American commercial ships in the Taiwan Strait next week? What stops Iran from closing the Strait of Hormuz, citing U.S. precedent? We rely on freedom of navigation more than any other country. By breaking the rules to hurt Maduro, we are smashing the very shield that protects American commerce globally. To wrap this up, let's go back to that phrase. We keep it, I guess. That phrase embodies the danger of this moment. It represents a foreign policy that is reactive, legally ambiguous, and dangerously detached from democratic accountability. We are witnessing a pivotal moment where the executive branch is testing the limits of its power. They are testing whether Congress will push back. They are testing whether the courts will unseal those warrants. And they are testing whether the American public will accept might makes right as long as it's wrapped in a flag. The United States is strongest when we lead by example, when we uphold the law, even when it's difficult. When we act with allies, when we respect the Constitution's war powers. Taking shortcuts using sealed warrants for war, bypassing Congress might feel like strength in the moment. It might make for a tough soundbite. But in the long run, it weakens the institutions that make America exceptional. Institutions don't protect themselves. Democracy doesn't run on autopilot. It requires citizens who pay attention, who ask under what authority, and who demand that their leaders follow the rules. So I want to hear from you. Where do you draw the line? Do you believe the president should have the power to seize foreign assets and deploy troops based on secret warrants if the target is a bad actor? Or do you believe that even when dealing with dictators, the U.S. government must follow the Constitution and get congressional approval? Does the end justify the means, or are the means the only thing that separates us from the regimes we criticize? If you want to stay ahead of these stories, the ones that impact your tax dollars, your rights, and your world, make sure to subscribe. We dig past the headlines to find the precedents that matter. This situation in Venezuela is developing fast, and the sealed warrant war is likely just beginning. We'll be here to track every legal move. I'm Daniel Kershaw. Thank you for watching, and stay vigilant.